boys and girls, and welcome back to the tour of Norway, where we are flying through some of Norway's most beautiful scenery while trying to tell you some stories along the way about what we see. We are here at Sogndal airport, where we left off in the last video, and before we leave we'll have a quick look at today's routes. So this is Norway, and this is the grand tour that we are making. And today we will fly south here from Sogndal through a side arm of this fjord called Sognefjorden. And this side arm has three interesting spots that we are going to visit: Undredal, Eilandsvangen and Flom. And from here we will make a very steep climb over these mountains into a valley called Gudvangen. And we will follow this valley all the way up until we reach this crossroads called Vossevangen, which is situated between three mountains. And it's an important regional meeting spot. And from here we will go further south into Hardangerfjorden, which along with Sognefjorden up here is probably the two most important fjords in all of Norway, at least historically. And from there we will go straight west to Bergen, which is the largest town in western Norway and the second largest city in all of Norway. So it's going to be the first truly urban part of this tour of Norway, which I'm looking greatly forward to. So without any further ado, I think we can just get this show on the road. Gear up, and welcome back to the skies of Norway. Now for today's video we will be doing things slightly differently than what we have done in the previous videos. First of all, whenever I talk about something of particular interest, I'm going to edit in a small photo of what I'm talking about. And this is so that if you're curious as to how these things actually look like in real life, you won't have to go down and click links all the time. So I hope that won't be too much of a disturbance if you're not really interested. The second thing, which is going to be a little bit different, is that we are going to play two very small pieces of some music, which I think is relevant to some of the things I will be talking about. But that will be towards the end of the video. Now there is a small risk that this might constitute a violation of YouTube's copyright policy, but I've thought about it and I considered that it in this case is going to constitute fair use. But if this video suddenly disappears, you will know why, and then I might have to re-upload it with these pieces of music as links instead. But let's hope YouTube or whoever watches these things agrees that it's going to be fair use. So now we are entering into this southern side arm of Sognefjorden. And this place is called Eilandsfjorden. And Eilandsfjorden is on the UNESCO World Heritage List, along with a couple of other fjords in Norway. And this is probably one of the reasons why each year, every summer, you'll see hundreds of cruise ships sailing down towards the end of this fjord. So all the famous cruise ships like Queen Mary II and the Royal, you know, the largest ones in the world, they all sail down here. And of course that's good for the local economy, but I also know that there has been some concerns that this huge cruise traffic is really polluting this nature pearl. Now, the fjords of Norway, they stretch into the country like branches of a tree. And they all have various side arms. And each of these arms have their own names. So this arm of this arm is called Nærøysfjorden. And it's also on the UNESCO World Heritage List, and it's truly spectacular. So I'll show you a quick photo of how it looks like in real life. So as you can see, it's as beautiful as this game is, it doesn't really match reality. The second point of interest on this small little fjord trip here is coming up right over here. And it's a place called Undredal. It's a tiny little village of 100 people and 500 goats. So you might be asking, why on earth am I talking about such a tiny little village? And the reason is that, well, they're famous for their goat cheese for one. But they also have, I think you can see it right over here, the smallest stave church in the world. So I'll show you a picture of this. And it doesn't maybe look very impressive, but it's actually 1,000 years old. Of course, they have rebuilt the facade many times, so that's why it doesn't look particularly old. But if you go inside, you'll find many old parts of it, and it's really, really beautiful. And another fun fact about Undredal is that right up until the year 1988, it was completely isolated. There was no road access to that town. So the only way to go there was by a sailing boat, actually. But then in 1988 they built this hugely expensive road tunnel, and today you can't drive there. Over here you have another town called Aurlandsvangen, and they have this crazy road going in this zigzag pattern up on top of the mountain and then over the mountain. And right here is a place called Stegastein Gangbro, which is part of what we call the national tourist routes in Norway. And it's basically roads with spectacular scenery, where young architects, untested architects, are allowed to design these crazy road stops for tourists. And this is one of the more spectacular ones, although there are hundreds of these really cool stops along tourist roads in Norway. The other interesting thing about this town is that right here there's a road, as you can see, and it disappears into the mountain. And that is the longest... Whoa! Gotta be a little bit careful here. It is the longest road tunnel in the world, and they built it so you didn't have to cross over these mountains. And it's actually 25 kilometers long. And it's so long that they built 3 rooms inside at regular intervals, so that you wouldn't feel claustrophobic driving through it, because it's going to take you like 30 minutes to drive through. So I'll show you a picture of that. And these rooms are designed to be architecturally interesting, so you can stop there and walk a little bit around, and it's a cool road tunnel. Over here we have the town of Flom, and this is where all the cruise ships that I was mentioning, they anchor up here. And the reason why they go here is for the train line stretching over here. It's called the Flom line, and it continues up these mountains all the way into the high mountains, where it connects with the Oslo-Bergen line. And it used to be the main road out of this local area, or the main connection with the outside world. But after they got all these road tunnels, it was less popular, and it was slowly sort of turned into a tourist train trip instead. But it's very, very beautiful and very popular. And if you want to do a sort of low-budget trip of Norway, the best thing I could recommend would be to go to Oslo, spend a couple of days there, and then take the Oslo-Bergen train, which is also very spectacular. And then about halfway through that trip you can stop and you can take this local train and then go back a little bit later in the day and end up in Bergen. So down there you can see Underdal, the small goat village I was mentioning, and this is the road that they eventually built in the 80s. It disappears into a tunnel over here. And it's truly fascinating to drive down to this little village. You feel like you're coming to really the end of the road, literally. So now we're going to do a very rapid descent into the Norway, which I was mentioning. The way we are flying today would probably not be legal, so it's a good thing that we stay so close to the ground so that Norwegian radar won't detect us. Welcome to Norway. So right at the end there you can see a place called Gudvangen, which has a long history. Gudvangen in all the Norse language basically means a place for worshipping the gods. So this is where they would do sacred rituals and pray to Thor and Odin and maybe do some sacrifices. Looking at this scenery, I guess it's understandable why they would choose such a place as a place of rituals and prayers. The road leading through here, it's called E16, and it is the main route between Oslo and Bergen. Now, if you are very nerdy about painting, you might have heard about a Norwegian painter called Johan Christian Dahl, or J.C. Dahl. And he is, I'm not sure most Norwegians have really heard about him, but he is one of the most famous national romantic painters in Norway. And he spent most of his life in Germany, actually, in Dresden. And he has also made some really, really beautiful paintings from Central Europe, German cities back in the 1800s. But in Norway he is famous for some of his highly scenic national romantic paintings. And possibly the most famous painting he ever made, it's called Stalheim, which is the area we are flying through right now. And he made the painting at his studio in Dresden, but he came here to this farm over here and made sketches for it. So standing right here, this is the place where one of the most famous paintings in Norwegian history was made. So if I turn the camera around, you'll see the motif that he saw. You can see it's very beautiful, but if we compare it with the painting, you can see that he also he took some artistic liberties, to say the least. This painting has all the cliches of Norwegian national romanticism, like a medieval farm, western coast style, and a rainbow across the mountains, and it's very, very spectacular. fun fact about this Johan Dahl is that when he lived in Dresden, where he made this painting, he lived with another famous painter called Caspar Friedrich. Possibly haven't heard that name before, but you've definitely seen some of his paintings, and one of his most famous painting is this very illustrative painting of the 1800s with a man standing on top of a mountain looking over the misty clouds with peaks rising over the mist. And as far as I've understood, this painting has always come to sort of signify the longing for nature and being alone and Weltschmerz, possibly. So a very typical painting of the 1800s, and also a painting that I'm sure many Norwegians can identify with. So now we are climbing up this valley to Voss, as I was mentioning, and at the bottom of this valley you see, as I mentioned, the road of E16, which is the main route between Oslo and Bergen. Although it's not actually the fastest one. It's going to take you a total of maybe 8.5 hours to drive through this road from Bergen to Oslo, which is very, very long, and you can see the road is not it's not exactly an expressway. But there are other roads. None of them are expressways though, but there are other roads, and some of them are faster. But this is still considered the main road because it's the only reliable one. It travels through these valleys, and during the winter time it's quite likely to be open, whereas some of the faster routes, they will very often suffer blizzards, and then you won't get anywhere. So if you're driving through Norway in the winter, this is the way to go. At least if you have a fixed deadline that you need to meet. And E16, fun fact, it actually starts in Ireland, and it goes through Ireland, Scotland, Norway and Sweden. Although this is all just in theory, because there is sadly no ferry between the United Kingdom and Norway anymore, although there used to be. Right here, I believe, you can't really see it in the scenery of this game, but this is the scene of a very famous waterfall called Tvindefossen. This is just one of hundreds of beautiful fjords that you will stop by and look at if you travel through Norway. But for some reason during the 1990s, I presume it was maybe the local farmer, clever guy, who started the rumor that drinking from the waters of Tvindefossen would rejuvenate your sexual potency. So every year, I've heard 200,000 people stop there to drink from the waters, and it's especially popular among Japanese, Americans and Russians. I have no idea how they heard about this, but they're probably being told by some tourist guide as they drive through this valley in their buses. So now up ahead of us is the town of Voss, which is the all-important crossroads between these mountains. This is not only where the main route between Oslo and Bergen crosses through, but also the main train line, called the Bergen line. And during the Second World War, this town was the central mobilization point for all forces in this part of Western Norway, because Bergen had already been occupied in the first day. And what they would do is that they would ship most of these Western soldiers on the trainway line here into Eastern Norway to join the fight there, which they thought was more important. And then only a handful of troops would sit in this valley and hold the Germans who marched up from Bergen. And as in Gudbrandsdal in the first video, this place wasn't too difficult to defend, and the Germans had a tough time breaking through. But the consequences were very sad for Voss, because the Germans responded as they often did during the Second World War. They terror bombed this city. So I'll show you a picture of how it looked like after the bombing. So as a consequence, today you won't find many historical buildings left in Voss. And in the end, the Germans had to walk all around this mountain and come down here to outflank the Norwegians. And then Voss finally surrendered. And that, I believe, was the end of the Battle of Western Norway. So this Bergen line, which I mentioned, which runs from Oslo to Bergen, it is a train trip I have done so many times in my life, because during my military service I was stationed in Bergen and I had my girlfriend in Oslo. And if you are in uniform, which I guess is probably the same procedure in most countries that have conscription, you can travel virtually for free if you are in uniform. So almost every weekend I would travel with the Bergen line, which of course is an interesting way to commute. The Norwegian state television actually made a slow TV film just showing the entire trip, and it's on YouTube. I'll post a link below, and it's worth checking out some moments of this trip. It has a very beautiful scenery. But it takes so much time. It has 32 stations. The train doesn't stop, or 39 stations it has. The train doesn't stop at every station, but still it's going to take you between 7 and 8 hours. And the train is notoriously unreliable. To be fair, it's over 100 years old. And back in the beginning, when it was built, it was really one of the proudest achievements in the Norwegian engineering history, because building all that infrastructure over the difficult terrain of the high mountains wasn't easy, I can tell you that. Famously, these builders who did most of the work, they're called rallar. They're sort of folk heroes today. But anyways, the Bergen line hasn't changed much since it was built those 100 years ago, which is the reason why it is so slow and unreliable today. And there has been talk of maybe building a high-speed line between all the largest cities in Norway. And a couple of years ago, I remember they hired a expert team from Deutsche Bahn in Germany, and they did an analysis. And I don't remember exactly what their conclusion was, but I do remember what the politicians concluded, which I think is not entirely unreasonable. And the conclusion was basically that Norway has too high wages, the population is too scattered, and the scenery, the landscape is so difficult to build in, that building a high-speed rail line through these mountains, it would just be outrageously expensive with very limited advantages, because the train couldn't stop too many times, or you would lose the main advantage of a high-speed railway line, meaning that you could really service that many people. So they decided to postpone it, but it is said that they will build it within the next 100 years. So we can look forward to that, or maybe our grandchildren can look forward to it. But what the politicians concluded, it's all true. So in a way, I don't blame them, even though I would love to see a high-speed rail link between Oslo and Bergen. Now we are in the Hardanger Fjord, the second famous fjord in Norway. And right over here, you can see it over there. It doesn't look very spectacular in the simulator, but this is a very, very nice bridge in real life. It's called the Hardanger Bridge, and it's one of these 3-4 routes that I mentioned that you can drive from Oslo to Bergen. And it is the longest suspension bridge in all of Norway, and one of the 10 longest in all of the world. Driving on it is really, really spectacular, because you cross, the towers that suspend the bridge are really impressive, and then you just drive straight into the mountain where you have this another really long tunnel network with its own roundabout and cool architectural installations. So this is yet another one of those places I would recommend that you drive if you ever drive in this part of Norway. And this valley down here, this is called Aga. And as you can see, it has loads of farms down here by the water. And these are one of the very few fruit farms in all of Norway. I don't think fruit is that easy to grow in Norway, but for some reason the climate in this valley is very suitable. And it goes all the way back to the 1200s when some English monks came in here and they started growing plums and cherries and apples. So when I went through here, I thought, if you know how a fruit farm basically looks like, it looks like a vineyard. So even though we're very, very far north, it feels like you're in France or in the Mosel Valley in Germany or something like that. It's really, really beautiful. And this area also has like a Gudbrandsdalen, some really old medieval farms where you can sleep and visit. It's open to the public with farm buildings that are 1,000 years old. And the farms here, they were built very differently than the farms in the east. They're called klyngetun, and they're basically built around a small square in the middle, which is sort of protected from the harsh climate of Western Norway. So Hardanger is very famous in Norwegian folklore. This is also one of those places which has been painted over and over again through history, and I'll show you yet another painting which is I'm sure every Norwegian has seen this painting in a school book or something. It's called A Wedding Trip Through Hardanger, and it shows wedding, what do you call it, trip on a boat through this beautiful fjord. And again, this is sort of romanticizing the culture and the people who traditionally lived in these lands. Another cool thing about this fjord is that it, as most of the fjords here in Western Norway, has a long Viking history. I don't know if you have ever seen any Viking movies or Viking television shows. I know there is a HBO, I believe, television show called The Vikings, which is okay. Personally, I don't think there has been made any truly great Viking movies as of yet, which is a little bit strange because the literature, the historical literature about Vikings, what we call the sagas, it has just the most amazing stories that you could ever want for a juicy Hollywood script with love and vengeance and violence and all of that popcorn stuff. And it would just make, well, some of those stories are just absolutely amazing and would make for the perfect movie in my opinion. But the perfect Viking movie has yet to be made. If, however, I had to name what I think is the best Viking movie, I would name The Vikings from 1958 or something like that, with Kirk Douglas. And maybe I'm a little bit biased because one of the reasons why I like this movie so much is that it has a very cool scene where Kirk, or Rolf as he is called in the movie, they return from a raid on England, and they sail in here and they play this spectacular music as they return to their settlement somewhere along the coast here. I'll put a link to this scene in the details below. Of course, the movie is not amazing, but it is a pretty good Viking movie. Our last point of interest today before we head for Bergen is situated right here, and it's called, or it's here, it's called Nordheimsund, and there's a couple of things I can tell you about this place. First, it was a yearly place where Emperor Wilhelm II would go each summer in the beginning of the 1900s. Now, Wilhelm II, if you remember, he was the Emperor of the German Empire. The guy who famously maybe wasn't the most competent leader in the world, and also has to bear some of the blame for why the First World War broke out. Well, anyways, this Wilhelm II, he was a huge fan of Norway, and he would sail into these fjords every summer. And one of his regular stops was right here, so that he could hike up here to a waterfall, which is somewhere around here, which he really liked. Wilhelm II, he was also instrumental in rebuilding a town called Ålesund, a little bit further north, when it burnt down during this period. And I think, at least to a certain extent because of him, Ålesund was rebuilt in the style of Jugendstil, which was a popular architectural style back then. And I think this was really to the benefit of Ålesund, because today I would at least consider it the most beautiful city in all of Norway. Another thing about Nordheimsund is that there used to live here a composer called Geir Tveit. And he's maybe not so famous as he could have been. I don't think many Norwegians have heard about him, because he was a little bit of a political idiot, if I might say. He did sympathize to a certain extent with the Nazis and got mixed up with them during the war. And then I do believe later he sort of realized that they weren't that great, and I know he did write some editorial pieces defending Jewish music, and he also helped the Norwegian resistance. Maybe this was cynical, or maybe it was his conscience, I don't know. But anyways, after the war he went into exile in this village, and he would live here for many years and write really, really beautiful music about these lands. This music was sort of a mix between local folk music and classical French compositions. So now for a short while I will play you a piece of this music, which is this mix of local music and classical music. So just sit back and enjoy while we watch the scenery and continue towards Bergen. small part of his Geirtveit's Hardanger tunes. So right behind these mountains we will come into Bergen, the second largest city in Norway. And when I say city, you might think a place with millions of people, but Bergen only has 300,000 people living there. The whole metropolitan area has around 500,000 people. So cities in Norway, that's a relative thing, I guess you could say. But despite the relatively small population, Bergen has a very long and interesting history. And I would say that for most of Norway's history, Bergen was actually the most important city, and probably the most sophisticated city as well. And I think people from Bergen, they are themselves very aware of this. This is part of their identity and their culture. So the reason why Bergen was so important is that it very quickly, in the Middle Ages, became the main trading post in all of Norway. And just to give you an example, in the 1200s there was an English monk living in Bergen, and he wrote that in the course of one day he would see 200 trading ships sailing into this medieval town, and he would hear 10 different languages on the streets. Some of them he wouldn't even recognize. So all the way out here in the medieval ages you actually had a multicultural trading city, which I think is a little bit amazing. And its importance only grew. Bergen became the capital at a couple of points through our history. And in the 1300s it also became the main trading post for something called the Hansa League, which was this all-powerful trading bloc in the Baltic Sea, with its capital in Lübeck in Germany. And they built their own, basically their own district in Bergen, which you can still visit. It's called Bergen. And in the beginning there were only German families living there, and they would speak their own language and stick to themselves. But over time they would marry and mix with all the other people there, and I think this sort of strange mix of different cultures is what has led Bergen to be a little bit different maybe today than the rest of the country, and a little bit unique. And Bergen was probably also the first truly urbanized part of Norway, with its own urban culture, which produced a lot of writers and scientists and poets, musicians. Famously, the first Prime Minister of Norway, he was a rich business guy from Bergen, and also the current Prime Minister of Norway comes from Bergen. So it's a city of talented people, I guess you could say. We are coming up here on the suburbs of Bergen. Bergen was also the scene of really the decline of the medieval empire of Norway. In which year was it? 1362, I believe. A ship from England sailed into the port of Bergen, and they found dead people on board, and they were carrying the Black Plague, which of course was devastating to most of Europe, but it really hit Norway hard. I think maybe it's because of the climate. People lived very close together back then, and so the plague very easily infected whole families, and over half of the Norwegian population died back then, including almost all the Norwegian nobility, which is really the main reason why Norway was very easily annexed in the following years by the Kingdom of Denmark. We became a province in the Danish kingdom. And this is what we in Norwegian call the 400-year-long night. Because it's not seen as a very happy time in Norwegian history. Although I know some historians, they claim that maybe it wasn't so bad this time under Danish rule, because this was still very far from where everything happened, and people mostly lived very freely. So now we are coming up on downtown Bergen. Maybe it doesn't look very spectacular in the simulator, so I'll show you a couple of photos of how it looks like in real life. So this is the historical part of the city. Down here is what we call Bergen, which is this German district that I was telling you about. Basically all of this peninsula here has some really amazing architecture and very intimate small streets, and it's very well preserved. So I really like walking around here. And up here, this is where the rich people live. They have this spectacular view over the city, and they also have this very famous train track that you can take up on this mountain, which is called the Fløyen. If you've ever been to Hong Kong, it's very similar to the train track they have there, taking you up on the mountains of Hong Kong. Famously, Bergen is the city of 7 mountains, although no one really knows which 7 mountains are the 7 mountains of Norway. The whole concept of the 7 mountains was invented by a famous writer called Ludvig Holberg. Some Danes like to believe that he is Danish, because he's very popular in Denmark too, and this was during that 400-year period where if you wanted to become big, you had to go to Copenhagen. But he was born here and he loved the city, and he, inspired by Rome, which is also famous for its 7 mountains, named Bergen the city of the 7 mountains. But of course the city is much larger than just this part. You have suburbs over here, and all over these islands here and over here. So really, to travel around Bergen, you have to go through tens of tunnels. And going into each valley, it feels like coming into a completely different world, really. And when I used to live here, I lived out here, and I didn't really like this part of Bergen that much. So I always felt a sort of sigh of relief when I came through this tunnel leading through this mountain and into the old, nice historical part of Bergen. Even today, Bergen is still known for its culture. There's something called the Bergen Wave, which is this, began in the 70s really, and is this huge amount of popular artists making pop rock music, which has become very famous all over Norway and also all over the world. So maybe the most famous Bergen Wave band of all time is Røyksopp, which is this really brilliant electronica duo, which maybe you heard about. They make really great music. And today there is this rock band called Ratzika. It's a girl band I quite like. And they have this very funny song called Oslo, where they sing, Oslo, Oslo, you are nice, but you mean nothing to us. Nothing. Which I think is a little bit telling maybe of the mentality in this city to this day. So you'll find a link below to this song and all the others that I think are the most famous from the Bergen Wave. Now, the only problem, in my opinion, with Bergen is that it's too small. Like it has limited possibility to expand much further, and even though it is the second largest city in Norway, it sort of still lacks maybe all of the possibilities and services that you want for when you live in a major city. Although some people might also consider that a great advantage if you want sort of to escape the hassle of living in a big city. But for certain types of things, you still need to go to Oslo, in my opinion. And I also think that even though it has a great architectural history and heritage, when it comes to modern architecture, at least after the 1960s, Bergen has really built really terrible architecture compared to Oslo. Oslo has a lot of terrible architecture as well, but Oslo also has some really amazing pieces of modern architecture. Whereas in Bergen, the things they have built in the last 20-30 years, it's really not befitting the historical context this city has. So for example, this building over here, it's a high school. It was built very recently. I'll show you a picture. And maybe you don't think it's that bad. Of course, it's not that bad either, but just I think it's really, really bad in the context. So if there's any politicians from Bergen amazingly looking at this video, then please, I would beg you to maybe be a little bit more rigorous in what you approve. So this is the end of our trip. We will now come in for a landing at Flesland airport, which is over here. This huge island over here, it's part of the suburbs. It's called Sotra. I actually did my driver's license here in Bergen when I lived there, and we would often drive out here. And it has a huge oil industry, refineries, and they build platforms out here. And just driving out here at night and looking over that industrial landscape with the North Sea behind it, it was very, very awe-inspiring. And this here, this is the largest naval base in Northern Europe. It's called Håkonsvern, and this is where I was stationed. Norway doesn't have a very large navy. It has 5 frigates, 6 submarines, some minesweepers, missile torpedo boats, and logistic ships, and that's about it. And almost all of it is located at this base. As I said, I didn't like living here very much, but I did have a very great job in the military, which allowed me to travel all over the country, which is probably one of the reasons why I am making this video. And of course it was located right next to the airport, so each morning I could see all of the airplanes coming in to final approach. The airport isn't very big, but it does have quite a lot of traffic, and the reason is of course because the trains and roads in Norway are very slow. So if you want to commute between the major cities, most people they take the cheap airlines. So actually, if you look at the statistics over the most popular routes in all of Europe, Oslo Bergen, Oslo Trondheim, Oslo Stavanger, they are very high up on the list, despite Norway's small population. Rough landing again, but welcome to Bergen. Now we will park our airplane and take B-Bahn downtown and go to a place called Hulen, where we're going to party a little bit. Now, as we leave, I will play you a final piece of music. It's by possibly the guy who started the Bergen wave very early in history. He's a very famous violinist called Ole Bull, another proud son of Bergen. And back in the 1800s he wrote this very beautiful piece. So that was it for today's video. Thank you for watching, and come back next time when we cross back over the mountains in a completely different part of Norway, where we will see some industrial history and also tell some of the most spectacular stories from the Second World War in Norway. And after that, of course, we will go to Oslo. So thank you for watching, and that was it for me this time. Goodbye.